Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final installment, Module 8 of our course. I'm sure you're tired of my lecturing format, so I'm going to try and make this one brief, although I can't guarantee that it will be. This is about special education and bilingualism and English language learning. And I'm starting this off with the caveat that there are no current answers to many of the questions that we all have with respect to bilingualism and special education. I know many of you who work in monolingual educational settings right now struggle with this regularly. The challenges are just as pronounced in dual language settings when there's dilemmas around whether or not students with special needs should be included in dual language programs, and if so, how are services provided, things of that nature. All the same questions, complexified by the fact that instruction is going on in two languages. So with that, I'm going to share my screen with you. And so I do call this dilemmas because I think dilemmas is the right way to frame issues of special education in bilingual education and with bilingual learners. So key vocabulary, some of it's reviewed, some of it's not. So least restrictive environment, it comes up in the foundation text, but I really don't like its definition. The foundation's text says that the least restrictive environment is that students with disabilities should be given the opportunity to learn alongside non-disabled students in a regular classroom as much as possible. That is not my understanding of the term least restrictive environment, which is more, to me, almost philosophical. The least restrictive environment is the environment that will provide the maximum learning flexibility for the individual student. Where will that student learn such that it is least restrictive? It is the least restrictive place, considering other learning environments. Which one will be the least restrictive given the learning needs of the child? To me, that's philosophical, and it really deserves some thought and attention. It's the individual part that's in individualized education program that is coming out in the definition of least restrictive environment. And then some review terms relative to assessment are reliability. Remember, we said that a measurement, it measures consistently over time, a given construct. And then there's validity. Does it measure what it say it's measuring? And we did the assessment class with vocabulary, things like that, thinking about the construct itself, like vocabulary, and the cultural validity. Is the notion of vocabulary a culturally relevant one or not? So those are key vocabulary to keep in mind as we go through. I'm going to start with a case study. This is sort of plucked from my own experience as a bilingual resource teacher a long time ago in the Waltham Public Schools. Amalia is a pseudonym. And in my job as a bilingual resource teacher, I was often called into classrooms, particularly elementary classrooms, when teachers were concerned about students they had who were bilingual and they were considering referring them for special educational testing. And so you and your group should think of yourself as sort of the learning team that's designed, that they all have different names in different schools, but the team that's assigned to make determinations as to whether referrals will go forward. Okay, so this is my experience. So Amalia is a second grader. She's a Spanish-English bilingual. Her mother is Puerto Rican. She did Head Start preschool. Then when she got to the public school, she did a transitional bilingual kindergarten in first grade. Then she was mainstreamed in English in second grade. And the teacher is very concerned here in second grade based on her recent writing assessment, assignments that the teacher's been doing. And so here's one of the first assignments that caught the teacher's eye and sparked some concern. She asked her students, this was in spring, asked, what do you do on April Fool's Day? Write about it. And this is what Amalia wrote. You can see these two paragraphs here. The teacher looked at that and she really was concerned about the nature of the spelling, essentially, sort of what is going on with this student's language. And so she couldn't really figure out, especially paragraph 2 there, what Amalia is trying to say that she does on April Fool's Day. And so she had Amalia read to her, and Amalia sits down and reads to her, and down below is the transcript of her reading of the text. What we do in April Fool's Day is that you trick people, like to say something like look at that puppy, and they fall for it. Now, if you can follow me and track that back to what she wrote, you can see perhaps why the teacher was very concerned. For example, take is spelled T-O-U-Y-E. At least we think it does, or trick is spelled that way. People, P-I-L-A-L-S, Pilals. So this is confusing for the teacher. She's concerned, like this is not the kind of spelling that she typically sees with her students. So she went and she asked a couple other sort of writing prompts. One was, what did you do on your last big trip? And the other was, what do you see in the picture? And so one of the writings that Amalia does for the Puerto Rico trip is you can see what she wrote when I went to Puerto Rico, and you can read down the side there what Amalia reads back to her. When I went to Puerto Rico, I played with my cousins. I played with my cousins hide and go seek. I saw animals with different colors like birds and butterflies and puppies and cats. I saw the people in Puerto Rico buying fruit and vegetables in the store. They bought apples and bananas and tomatoes and vegetables. So the teacher is continuing to be concerned when she reads the spelling here. And then one more, she shows a picture of a cowboy laying on the ground next to a fire in the open desert with a horse next to him. And she just says, describe what you see in the picture. What I see in the picture is a horse eating grass. What I see in the picture is the man eating food with a stick. What I see in the picture is fire with sticks. So 3 different sentences, 3 different paragraphs. And again, the teacher is concerned because there are some highly irregular spellings here. And so I'm brought in to sort of assess this situation. And so I turn toward a diagnostic reading assessment, not the DRA, but I am diagnosing her reading. And I use the Woodcock-Munoz, much like we've looked at in the past, to assess her reading skill, her decoding skill, her language skills, and also her spelling skills. And so this is the result of some of the testing that was done. So you can look at the grade equivalent. So this is comparing Amalia to the grade equivalent of a native English-speaking second grade, or how does she perform relative to native English speakers? And what you see here is her English decoding, her word reading is very low at 5 months into kindergarten level. Her English listening comprehension is quite high, 3rd grade level, she's in 2nd grade. Her vocabulary knowledge, 2nd grade level, she's in 2nd grade. English reading comprehension, kindergarten, 4 months. So very low decoding and reading, high or average language. Then you can look over here to the right at her spelling test. And I'm going to have you stop and just consult with your group and make some initial, have an initial discussion of what you think the data are showing. These data, the reading and language data and the spelling data, and the writing data. What do you think might be going on? So pause me for just a minute and have a brief, 5-10 minute discussion about what you think is going on. Okay, I'm assuming you're back and you've discussed it. And so now I'm going to, having discussed that amongst yourselves, I'm going to switch gears and just give a little background on some issues relative to bilingualism, achievement on measures, and special education classification. So Marcelo and Carola Suarez Orozco are 2 of my heroes in sort of immigration research. And they came up with this, after extensive research, came up with this rather logical but interesting, in my opinion, conclusion. And that is that immigrant children achieve in these kind of trimodal patterns. They either achieve above their American-born peers, similar to their American-born peers, or below their American-born peers, which at first blush is kind of like obvious. Well, what else would it be? But what it really means, what they're really saying is, if you look at native English-speaking monolingual populations and how they perform on tests, you often get a distribution like the one you see in black. That is, it's a kind of constrained distribution. Like there's not, on the tails of that distribution, there's not a lot of people performing at those levels. Most of the performance is packed in really tightly around that mean, that dotted line that's running vertically, right? That's the mean of the average. And most kids, a vast majority, are performing at the mean, and then there are fewer and fewer at the tails, going away from that mean. What bilingual and immigrant students often do is they alter that distribution. They flatten it and they spread it out so that the mean, there's still a cluster of students performing at the mean, and the mean might even be similar. But the ranges around the mean are vastly expanded. That is, immigrant and bilingual children will perform substantively below that mean, and they will also perform substantially higher than that mean relative to US-born peers. So the range of performance is much broader, which is challenging because that means you have a broader range of proficiencies and aptitudes in a single classroom where there are lots of bilingual and immigrant kids. And so you see this, and we've talked about this sort of thematically throughout the course now, that using tests normed on monolingual kids with testing bilingual kids with measures normed from monolingual children sometimes shows distributions like what you see here. This is performance in picture vocabulary, much like we've looked at in previous classes. In Spanish on the horizontal axis, and in English on the vertical axis there. And so what you see is performance in Spanish relative to performance in English. And each circle is a child and their relative performance. So if you look at the far right at the top right, far top right, there's that one outlying dot. That's a kid who performed at 130 in Spanish and 110 in English. That's super high in both languages. That student is an outlier. Generally what you see is the higher the performance in Spanish, the lower the performance in English. It's an inverse correlation. But more importantly, what you see here is the bold dotted lines that go up from 100 and across from 100 represent the norming sample mean. So in these two tests, the norming sample average is 100 in Spanish and in English. But what you see with this group, the less bold dotted line, those are the norms for this sample. And so what you see is the norm for Spanish is lower, and the norm for English, the average for English is lower. And so you've got these kids clustered, if you look at the bold averages again, in the lower left-hand quadrant of those averages that is low performing in both languages. And that's because we're assessing kids, bilingual kids, with monolingual measures. And those always, almost always, will predict lower vocabulary scores in each language because it doesn't take into account the full vocabulary of the students. So assessing vocabulary cumulatively is usually more effective than the two monolinguals framework, which is what this is representing. So take a minute, pause me, jot down any questions you might have that you might want me to answer. Okay, next slide. Instances of overrepresentation. So in the book, I'm going to turn to the page. In the foundations text, you have that graph on page 333 that shows the percentage of U.S. students receiving special education services in 2014. And what that shows is African American and Native American students are the most likely to receive special ed services. And with an average of 13, African American students receive 15% have special education services, and 17% of Native American students have special education services. That's just broadly IEPs. You know, it doesn't disaggregate by disability category. And so I just want to show you some slides that do that. And when you do that, it actually heightens where the points of overrepresentation often happen. These are called odds ratios. So it's when you compare the likelihood of of something happening relative to a representative population. So in this case, if you look at the African American overrepresentation in special education, on the bottom there are ID and ED, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance. White students are 1. We're comparing African American students to white students. So white students are at 1. If you look at the number for intellectual disability, 2.24, that means African American students are 2.24 times more likely than white students to be labeled as having an intellectual disability, and 1.59 times more likely than white students to be labeled as having an emotional disturbance. With Native American students, you have a similar thing: intellectual disability, learning disability, emotional disturbance, 1.09, 1.24, and 1.12 times more likely than white students to be referred to those categories. With English learners and Latinx students by special ed, again, these data are not the newest, but sort of illuminating nonetheless. If you look at for English learners and for Hispanic learners, Latino learners, relative to white learners. So again, white learners are 1 here. You can see that anything above 1 is you're more likely to be referred, and anything below 1 means you're less likely to be referred. So what you see would really jump out for English learners are much more likely in all cases to be referred to special education for emotional disturbance, intellectual disability, learning disability, speech language, and overall special education. Not always the case for Latino learners. And overall special education is slightly lower, and I believe that is the case also in the figure 1 on chapter 15, where Latinx students are 12% of the special ed population versus 13% of white learners. So you see issues, particularly for English learners, as being referred to special education. And then you get this this general trend. Now, this is not longitudinal data, it's year by year, but the likelihood of being referred to special education, if you're an English learner, K to 12 relative to white students, again, 1 is your reference point. So in grades K, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all of those numbers are below 1. That is, English learners are much less likely to be referred to special education than native English-speaking white children. But then starting in secondary, grades 6 through 12, look at what happens. All of a sudden, English learners are far more likely to be referred to special education services. So what you see is, like in the elementary school grades, think of Amalia now, there's this, there can be this sort of wait and see kind of mentality, like, oh, it's second language acquisition, the tranquil view, silent period, we can wait and see what happens. But then the more you wait, you get to 6th grade and maybe it's like, oh my goodness, no, that's not it. It's actually, we need to be testing for special education services. Or in 6, 7, and 8 and beyond, English learners present with the content learning demands are much higher. The linguistic demands of secondary are much higher than in the elementary school. And so people move more quickly to a special ed diagnosis to get students the services that they need that might not be sufficiently delivered, for example, in an ESL context. No matter what you see is a jump in secondary of likelihood of being referred relative to a lower likelihood of being referred in elementary. And overall, what you typically see as general patterns is African Americans and Native Americans overrepresented in MR, that is intellectual disability, or emotional disturbance. And English learners tend to be overrepresented in learning disabilities and speech language impairments. And what they share in common is underrepresentation in gifted and talented programs, as the foundation text discusses also. And what you see with Asian American and Pacific Islanders is an overrepresentation in gifted and talented, and an underrepresentation across all these other special educational categories. This is where people start talking about the social construction of disability. I mean, there are no genetic reasons why African Americans and Native Americans would be overrepresented with intellectual disabilities or emotional disturbance, or that Asian American Pacific Islanders would be overrepresented in gifted and talented. That's not a genetic thing. There's something other than that going on. And there is this dimension of social construction of disability, of the factors to which students are exposed outside of school, living conditions, poverty, things of that nature that are discussed in the text. And so very worth thinking about when these labels are going to be applied, why are they being applied, and what criteria are they based on? So teachers have dilemmas, right? So that it's to refer or not to refer. That's the question. These notions of stage theories of second language acquisition, those are insufficient for practice, for bringing together theory and practice into something that's meaningful for student learning, right? So that's our second language acquisition lecture was all about, the sort of the chaos theory of second language acquisition. Stage theories are not going to get us there. And we need to understand sequential and simultaneous bilingual language development alongside knowing your student, where they come from, what they've been through, etc. Principals have dilemmas too. The mainstream teacher in this case might refer Amalia because she needs increased attention. The teacher doesn't think she can give it to her, and so perhaps she can get that, the principal can have that taken care of through a resource room when all of her ESL teachers maybe are stretched too thin. And so a special education and individualized education plan is written up, but maybe it's not totally necessary. Then we have to worry about things like Matthew effect. So when you put kids in lower reading groups, they tend to stay in lower reading groups. And if we can avoid that, we want to. Versus a perceived need for special education services, but the team might take a wait and see attitude, start citing those stages of second language acquisition, right? So should we do it? She needs support, but she doesn't need to be in special education, we don't think. Maybe she does, not sure. Well, she's only in second grade. It could be, early stages of, she could be simply in pre-production, and so she just needs a little bit more time. Which do you do? It's a total dilemma when you want to do right by the child. Okay, and so one thing that we did, and you might have thought that this would have been a good idea, was that we said, hey, you were in a transitional bilingual program. This is about knowing the student. Maybe we should ask you to write what you did on your last big trip in Spanish. So take a look at what she wrote. Spanish speakers in the group. Stop me, and to the non-Spanish speakers, explain to them what you think about the writing here relative to spelling, comprehensibility, etc. Okay, we're back. The next one, what did you do on April Fool's Day? What do you see in the picture? So when I had her write in Spanish responses to those same prompts, what we see is her Spanish writing is perfectly developmentally appropriate, whereas her English writing had some spelling issues, right? So what does that mean? In your opinion, what does that mean? And I've posted this PowerPoint to the website so that you can look through it at your leisure. But here's the assignment for this class. Write a group summary and recommendation. You're the response team in your school. The teacher has brought this student to you with these data. What's your recommendation? What would be the least restrictive environment for Amalia? And what should be done within that least restrictive environment to support her learning? So, and make sure you specify the educational context. That is it monolingual or bilingual? Does that make a difference? If it's an English-only context, what kind of supports would be reasonable to provide for Amalia? Versus if it's a bilingual, educational, dual language bilingual context, would those supports be different, and why? So this doesn't have to be very long, maybe a paragraph on what the summary recommendation would be given a chosen context, monolingual or bilingual, and why you think that context, how that learning context helps drive the recommendation that you would make for developing the least restrictive environment for Amalia. Thanks. I'm going to end the show. I'm going to stop my share and say good luck. And I look forward to reading your summary recommendations. Thanks very much. See you.